I imagine myself like a fish in a fish tank. And here I am trying to describe dryness to my fellow aquatic creatures. What do I say? Well, it's not wet. They respond, what's wet? How do you answer that when wet is all you know and can perceive? How can you communicate that there is a space in which we all exist but find hard to see? This tank is within a larger space, perhaps a room. And this life, the life that I live, is within a larger reality where God fills all. And even when we do get glimpses, it's like trying to peer out of the thick and opaque glass of a fish tank. Or maybe I am like a fish trying to describe a large hand that comes into the water and drops food. Didn't the food just appear as a natural event, say the other creatures? It's a rhythm of nature that the food appears at 6 p.m. each evening. To which my imaginary fishy self replies, didn't you see? Didn't you notice the 5-pronged object holding a container out of which came food? This is the second in our series about learning to notice God, learning to be alert to glimpses of extraordinary moments, learning to see divine love in the most ordinary things, learning to perceive that we are part of an existence that is bigger than we can imagine. We have to become re-enchanted with the world as it is in actuality, something far more wonderful than we imagine, suffused with the presence of love. Welcome to Dchurched.com, a place for those who want to continue to walk with Jesus outside the four walls of the church. In our last podcast, we talked about how Jesus said the presence of God and his work has arrived. He said there are signs for those who have eyes to see. And with that comes the challenge of whether we will open our eyes. This time I'd like us to think about the background of Jesus saying the presence of God is near among you and its implications for us. Jesus' statements have a historical background. They don't come out of the blue. They have a context and a meaning that goes back 1,500 years or more. In Genesis 1, we're probably all familiar with the story of the 6 days of creation followed by the day of rest. But the language there, you may not know, is language used of a temple dedication, typically a Babylonian temple. At the end of the 6 days of ritual, there would be a 7th day in which the idol would be brought into the temple and described as what? Resting in the temple. And the phrase is a phrase that kind of is a bit like a king having set everything in order, sits on his throne. All is right with the kingdom. The king comes into his own, is a way of putting it. But in Genesis 1, it's the Lord, not a pagan god, and he doesn't come into a temple made of stone or wood. The whole earth is his dwelling. The whole earth is his temple. He is not just a local god or deity. He is king of all the earth. He is ruler of all, and his presence and temple is everywhere that you can see. And humans are there in Genesis 2 like servants of this king to serve his wishes and to reflect his will into all of creation. So why am I saying that? Well, the point is that the kingship of God pervades the whole earth. The presence of God's rule and reign pervades the whole earth. And humans are there as servants of this king to act as his image bearers. In contrast to the role of humans in other societies of the time who were mere underlings, minions, and just to be abused and thrown away by the gods, Genesis says humans are precious, made in God's image, described by one writer as angled mirrors to reflect God out into the world. Now here's a long story kept short. That reign and rule of God over all the earth and into all of his creation was distorted and all but lost when humans failed to live as image bearers and as servants of the king. That is the repeated story of Israel. And so there was promised a king who would come and be the bearer of God's sovereign love back into God's world. That was the entire Old Testament summed up in a few sentences to the point of distortion. But this provides us the context into which Jesus comes along and says, the kingdom is at hand, the presence of God, the presence of the ruler is at hand, among you, is here. And the first thing people would say is, who is this guy who's saying this? And the answer should have been, but wasn't always, this is the agent, the herald, the bringer of the presence of God, God's presence as King on earth. And so this passage is primarily about who Jesus is, the bringer of God's presence. The religious types didn't recognize him as that. And so Jesus says, open your eyes, I'm here among you. Notice God's presence. That's kind of at the heart of the message. So let me summarize what I've said in this podcast so far and in the last podcast. Firstly, the promised king has come to earth to reestablish God's presence and rule. That was promised in the Old Testament, and that is what Jesus seems to be claiming for himself. You might struggle with that concept at the moment, that's okay, but it seems to make sense of the cultural and historical context in my view. So just sit with that for the time being, even if you're struggling with that idea. Secondly, he's established a people who are bearers and heralds of that same rule. So like Jesus, they are called Christ-ins, Christians, proclaimers of God's presence on earth. Now again, you might struggle with that concept, and Christians maybe haven't looked much like Jesus to you. And I'm sorry if church has not given you a sense of God's presence at times. But try and sit with it just for a little while. Third thing I want to say in summary here is that the signs of God's reign are out there in God's world to be seen, not just within the four walls of a church. The king has come to his temple, and the physical temple that was in Israel was found wanting, but the king has come to the whole earth. The whole earth is his temple. Fourth thing, not everybody recognized what Jesus' presence meant in his day. Maybe you said, if I could just have met Jesus, maybe I'd feel a little bit more confident in my faith or my spirituality or something. But not everybody recognized it. Many didn't. And particularly those who had preconceived notions, whether religious or not. So a challenge, I think, to all of us is to put our hearts in neutral and say, okay, defense is down. If God and spiritual things and spirituality is real, I still want to find it. Defense is down. I suspect Jesus might say to us, the signs are still there to be seen. Will you notice or will you dismiss them? Are you open to re-enchantment? I don't want to be like the dumb fish who can't see the hand that feeds, or the religious leaders who have their own view of what God's stuff looks like, but miss the irony of failing to see Jesus when he's standing right in front of them. So we have to learn to notice the king at work. Matthew 25 says that they are serving others and they don't really notice Jesus. They've developed servanthood and hospitality into an instinct, which is fantastic. And it is worship to Jesus himself, and they get a reward. But can you imagine if they had eyes to see the image of God in that other person, the presence of the king in that other person? John 1 says he is the light that lights every person who's come into the world. Every single person. Imagine we had eyes to see that. Every human, the ugliest to the most beautiful, the tall, the short, the fat, the thin, the easy to get on with, the real pain in the neck, the kind people, the horrible people. Somehow God's presence and image is still there. How would we treat others differently? Or imagine being able to notice God in the daily, ordinary things we take for granted. How would that change your perspective on a mundane Monday, or a terrible Tuesday, or a woeful Wednesday? Every day would be a discovery. Not long ago, my wife asked me what I was most grateful for in that given day. And I thought for just a second, I went, fish sauce. We'd had a wonderful meal by the beach, and I'd had fish with a beautiful sauce. And for me, it was a taste of heaven. Even in the ordinary things, God is there to be noticed. Even the creativity of that chef who made that sauce. We say we notice God in a sunset or a beautiful scene or a majestic animal. What if we could notice God in the old familiar things? How might we be transformed? The mundane transformed. What about within ourselves? Becoming aware that God is at work in us, transforming us into his likeness, replacing the old narratives of self-doubt or defeat or despair with a new narrative of being made in the image of divine love. Well, over the next few episodes, I would like us to explore some ways we can learn to do that even more than we have been. Let's hear these words from Elizabeth Barrett Browning as we finish. Earth is crammed with heaven. Every common bush is afire with God. But only those who see take off their shoes. The rest sit around and pluck blackberries. Start this week. Don't get distracted by the blackberries. Begin to see. Begin to notice. You've been listening to Dchurched.com. Join us on our Facebook page and let's continue the conversation.